Our next presenter is Dr. Andrew Skilton, who is an associate faculty member at the Faculty of Asian and Middle Eastern Studies at Oxford University, who changed their name recently, copying Cambridge, for example. So his research interests include Buddhist narrative literature, the interpretation of Buddhist text, Buddhist meditation, and the Samadhi Raja Sutra. And his current research projects involve Viticita and the Jietuo Daolun, revising and retranslating the Dīpavamsa text and exploring aspects of the Purāṇ Kamatan meditation tradition. He teaches courses on Buddhist studies, Pali, language and literature, advanced Pali, and Buddhist Sanskrit text. So please welcome Dr. Andrew Skilton, who is presenting remotely.
So, can people hear me?
Yes.
Wonderful, amazing. I can't see you anymore, but so I'm going to be speaking to my own PowerPoint presentation on screen. Can you see the PowerPoint, by the way?
Yes.
Yes.
Good. Great, wonderful. We're ready to go. I'd like to start by thanking Professor Galambos and Prakyatisak for the original invitation to participate in this workshop, and also the organisers, which include Chris Jones, for all the work they've done, including accommodating my withdrawal from attending at almost the last minute, which has involved changes for all of them, I think. So thank you very much for that. Like Heinrich Sørensen introduced his, in the same way that he introduced his work, I would say that this is not work in progress so much. I'm not going to be talking about work in progress so much as an ongoing interest which spans perhaps 45 years, the last 45 years, and began with my taking up a visualization sadhana in a general Mahāyāna context and engaging with that over a long period of time, about 20 years, I think. And then subsequently, in the kind of late 80s, writing about the Mahāgovinda Sutta from the Pali Canon. And after that, round about 2003, maybe, participating in a workshop on visionary experience, which was held at a different university in a different theology faculty, at Cardiff University, which was a theological enterprise, but attended by a couple of Indologists, which rather, I think we were rather an irritation to the theologians because we kind of messed things up in a way, and the obvious strategy therefore was to ignore us. So I would say, and you'll see the spread of this across what I say, or what I'm going to say, over the next half hour. In general, my title is Visualizing the Buddha, or Brahmā, in early Buddhism. I've added Prom after Brahmā with reference to my colleague Pibulin Chumpampaisan's presentation, in which he referenced Prom so frequently, Brahmā. I can't remember if he actually explained that Prom meant Brahmā in his presentation, but and I'm going to really talk about two things. I'm going to talk about a possible early model for visualization meditation, and I also want to talk about a kind of methodological issue or a typological issue, and I'll be covering both of those aspects, I hope, in what I go on to say. So my own personal starting point was Buddha and Bodhisattva visualization in the context of my own personal practice of Buddhism. I've already said, in a Mahāyāna context, a non-esoteric context, I was given a sādhana, which is a set of instructions or a method for visualizing a particular figure, which in this case was Manjushri, or more specifically Manjughosha. And Manjushri is has a number of epithets, which include Panchashika, the five-crested one. Panchashika literally means five crests. And he's also referred to as Kumara Bhuta, the youth. Yeah. And in this slide, we can see two images of, I think one of Manjughosha and one of Manjushri. So on the left, we have an Indo-Tibetan image, which is very similar to the kind of tradition in which I was practicing. But on the right, we have a lovely Chinese image of the same figure of Manjushri, holding the sword of wisdom in the right hand and a copy of the Prajnaparamita Sutra in the left. In the Indo-Tibetan image on the screen at the moment, the Perfection of Wisdom Sutra is on a lotus, and the stalk of the lotus is held in the left hand of the Bodhisattva. And I'm sure we're all familiar with images like this, and I would guess that most people understand that images like this, particularly the Indo-Tibetan one, are related to meditation practice. And I came to develop a kind of sense of a broad kind of structure for sadhana, for visualization at this time, and this is something of a simplification and something of a generalization. I'm sure there are multiple exceptions to what I have on screen at the moment, but that, you know, the sadhana consists initially of an act of going for refuge, of saranagamana, followed by a phase of the development of the Brahma Vihara, the Brahma Vihara being the set of 4 meditations which begin with Metta Bhavana or Maitri Bhavana, the cultivation of universal loving kindness or friendliness, of Karuna, of Mudita and Upeksha. And so going for refuge, followed by cultivation of the Brahma Vihara, followed by the development of some kind of action which is connected with insight into shunyata, some cultivation of some sense of emptiness, of the absence of the, shall we say, the Dharma Nairatmya. Yeah. And then this would be followed by the visualization of the Buddha or Bodhisattva figure. And this is a visualization that would be built by the practitioner as a mental image from a prescribed set of instructions which describe the iconography of that figure. And when the image is built, as it were, or constructed, there might follow a period of recitation of a mantra or some other kind of transfer between the visualized image and the practitioner, the meditator. And then the meditation would conclude with the dissolution of the vision, the dissolution of the visualized image in one way or another. And there are a number of methods whereby that image might be dissolved. So for those who know a lot more about this than I do, I beg pardon for these kind of crudity of this simplified presentation. But I think this is a kind of fair representation of broadly what's involved in that kind of meditation. I now want to move on and talk about the text, the early Buddhist context, because some kind of 10 years into my use of this sadhana, I became aware of a text in the Dīgha Nikāya of the Pali Canon, the collection of long suttas called the Mahāgovinda Suttanta, which is the sutta or the discourse on the great steward or the great chancellor. Govinda literally means kind of lord of the cows, and it kind of really in context it means someone who takes responsibility for the running of the state. And so it's a story about a great chancellor. It has resonances in Britain, which maybe, and in Germany, which maybe should be. There are 5 textual sources for this text, 5 literary sources for this text. So there's the Dīgha Nikāya text in Pali. There's another version, which is different in significant ways, in the Mahavastu, in Buddhist hybrid Sanskrit. There's the Gilgit Dirgha Agama version, which has survived in a single manuscript found at Gilgit in Sanskrit, associated with the Mula Sarvastivada school, but is very fragmentary. And I understand that the quality of the copying in these the Gilgit-Dirgha Agama is not good. And then there are two Chinese translations. There's the Dharmaguptika version of the Dirgha Agama, in which the equivalent of the Pali Mahāgovinda Sutta is Sutra number 3 in the Dirgha Agama, so Taisho 1.3. And then there's an independent Chinese translation, which I think is related to the Mahavastu version, which is Taisho 8. So there are 5 textual sources. And I should say that it's an interesting literary construction, which, amongst other things, could includes the possibility that it's one of the lost Jatakas. I think the kind of Pali canon geeks in the audience will know that the Jataka collection of the Pali canon supposedly contains 550 Jataka stories, Jatakas being stories about previous lives of the Buddha, the lives of the Bodhisattva. But in fact, in the collection, there are only 547. So there are 3 that are missing, and it's well, some people allow, and I would strongly suggest that the Mahāgovinda Sutta contains one of those lost Jatakas. This isn't an important thread to pursue now. And the text is also partly satirical, at least in the Jataka section. There are a number of satirical texts in the Pali collection, and this characteristic of the literature is discussed by a number of people. And I want to now go on. This is relevant, and it is a thread that I'll pursue because it is relevant to the story. The sutta begins with the Buddha being visited by a Gandharva, a supernatural being who is called Panchasika, 5 crests, or the 5-crested one. And he says to the Buddha, I've just been in the heaven of the 33. I've witnessed some amazing things. Would you like to know about it? And the Buddha says, yeah, go on then, tell me. And so he tells the story of what he's seen in the heaven of the 33. And what he's seen is the gods of the heaven of the 33 discussing the Buddha and praising him. This is all very circular and trifle narcissistic, but the gods have been praising the Buddha and saying how wonderful he is. And so Panchasika tells the Buddha how the gods have been saying how wonderful he is. And as the gods are doing this, and as Panchasika is watching, and I have to say, by the way, that the description of the assembly of gods for this process is very reminiscent of the creation of a mandala. But as the gods are praising the Buddha, they are visited by a Brahmā, in other words, by a higher deity, who emerges from the Brahmā realm. And this Brahmā is called Sanankumara. And Brahmā Sanankumara kind of asks what they're talking about. And then he says, do you want to know a bit more about how wonderful the Buddha is? And of course, the gods of the 33 say, yes, please do tell us. And so he starts telling a story of a past life of the Buddha, which is the Jataka section of the text. And this part is the satirical part, because this tells the story of a great chancellor who looks after the kingdom of a group of 7 kings. And he looks after the kingdom. He runs the affairs of state so well that eventually his reputation swells to such a level that people begin to say the great steward, Mahāgovinda, is so wise because he sees Brahmā in person. The great steward discusses, converses, and consults with Brahmā in person. And I give you the text on screen. The English is adapted from Sujato's online version. And the satirical component of this is that Mahāgovinda is really uncomfortable with this. And this is, of course, a satire on the Brahmin class, because Brahmins are supposedly see Brahmā or know Brahmā directly. And one of the major Buddhist critiques of the claims, the superior claims of the Brahmanical class, is that they don't see Brahmā at all. And in this little story, Mahāgovinda is attributed with seeing Brahmā directly in person, and he feels really uncomfortable. And he says, I can't put up with this. I can't have people saying that I can see Brahmā directly when I can't. And so he decides whoever goes on retreat, he says, well, they say that whoever goes on retreat for the 4 months of the rainy season and practices the absorption on compassion, karunanjananjayati, sees Brahma and discusses with him. And so he has an idea in mind that the way to see Brahma is to practice one of the Brahma Viharas. And he goes away and does that. He goes into a solitary retreat. And eventually, after 4 months of not seeing Brahma, Brahma took pity on him. And Brahma, the eternal youth, Brahmā Sanamkumara, knew what the great steward was thinking, and as easily as a strong person would extend or contract his arm, vanished from the Brahma realm and reappeared in the great steward's presence. And at that, the great steward became frightened, scared, his hair standing on end, as he had never seen such a sight before. So he addressed Brahmā Sanamkumara in verse, "Who are you, sir?" So although this is a voluntary exercise on Mahāgovinda's part, he's still alarmed when he experiences the vision. Now, what actually did he see? It doesn't say at this point in the text, and we can track back through the sutta to where Brahma appears to the in the heaven of the 33 for a description of what it's like for Brahma to visit you. And there it says, as the signs, the nimitta, show, this light arising and this radiance appearing, Brahma will appear. This radiance and light is the precursor sign, the pubanimitta, for the appearance of Brahma, this light arising and this radiance appearing. So the initial appearance of Brahma is just of an overwhelming bright radiance. And the text goes on to say, in this slightly earlier part of the sutta, a Brahma's normal appearance is imperceptible in the visual range of the gods of the 33. So then Brahmā Sanamkumara manifested in a solid corporeal form, taking on the appearance of the youth, Panchasika again, and appeared to the gods of the 33. Rising into the air, he sat cross-legged in the sky. So I think that we can see here in this rather early text, a possible model for the kinds of experience that, or certainly I felt that this was a model for the kinds of experience that I and other practitioners of sadhana were seeking to create. So first of all, there's a link between the practice of the Brahma Vihara and the visual experience of the Buddha, Bodhisattva, or in the case of the sutta, the Brahma. There are possible structural similarities with later sadhana. There are funny, probably insignificant continuities with Manjushri, the calling of the Brahma Panchasika. Yeah. And I think that what was clear to me when I first began thinking about this was that you have a practice of visualization, which is taken up by the practitioner, but the sutta is describing a kind of visionary experience, which is halfway between voluntary and involuntary. Yeah. And I did wonder whether we could characterize the difference between those two expressions, visionary experience and visualization, as in terms of a matter of agency. And of course, in the light of the earlier workshop on this topic that I attended in 2003, which was on visionary experience in a theistic context, this distinction about the visual experience, to use that term, is quite crucial. So my thinking is that we should not see Buddhist visualization as an isolated religious phenomenon. In other words, we should recognize that visualization and the visual experience is relevant in other religions. Yeah, and so I just want to go through some images. This is a lovely image from Sinai of Moses and the burning bush. Moses is in the wilderness and he sees a burning bush, but the bush does not burn. It's on fire, but it does not burn. Yeah, this is a supernatural experience. This is a visionary experience. Yeah. Muhammad, at one point, his career as a prophet begins with a visitation from Jibril or Gabriel when he's in seclusion in a cave, in a mountain cave. He's visited by Gabriel, who says to him, "You are the prophet of God." Yeah. I would suggest that this is a visual experience of some kind, a visionary experience. We have the extraordinary story of Krishna. Baby Krishna is a naughty child, as we all know, brought up by his foster mother, Yashoda. And one day he's eating soil. He's eating dirt, as it were, putting soil into his mouth. And his foster mother chides him and tells him to stop, and comes and opens up his mouth to kind of pull out the soil. And she pulls his mouth open and sees the universe. And of course, there's another kind of visionary experience. This is the Annunciation, which people from a Christian background will be very familiar with this. The angel Gabriel, again, appears to Mary, who becomes the mother of God, and announces that she will become the mother of God. This is a visionary experience of one kind or another, and this bears direct comparison with another kind of visitation. This is Maya's dream. The biological mother of God, Maya, is visited in a dream by a white elephant who enters her side. And this is the sign that she's going to give birth to a great big girl. And I just wanted to put these two images side by side. This is an Annunciation from the Christian tradition and Maya's dream from the Buddhist tradition, just to reflect on the use of animal intermediaries in visionary experience. I think that's a rather interesting topic in its own right. And of course, we've already seen the two Buddhas, and Kate, in her presentation, the first presentation of the day, mentioned the emergence of the Buddhas in the Shakyamuni and Prabhudaratna in the Lotus Sutra. And we've also heard a couple of presentations, Kate Crosby and Pibun Chumpampaisan, on Barankamatan. On the right, we have an 18th or 19th century image from a Samut Khoi manuscript, where a nimitta, a visualized object, or a visual object, is being held between the hands of an arhat. And on the left, we have another kind of image for nimitta in the Barankamatan tradition, because as we've heard, I think particularly from Kate, there are a number of approaches to this aspect of experience in the Barankamatan tradition, in which a kind of narrative interpretation is possible. So in other words, the nimitta might appear not in a prescribed form, as with the crystal sphere on the right-hand side, but also in another form, like here, a basket of limes, of green spheres. And these would, in a certain context, count as nimitta in that tradition. And finally, this lovely image by Henry Tanner, late 19th century, Annunciation, which I think is the nearest depiction I came across to what's described in the Mahāgovinda Suttanta. The depiction of Mary and the sense of awe and uncertainty really captures what's described in the sutta, and also the effulgent golden light of the Annunciation. So I thought that, we've got a number of different things going on here. And what we need, if we're going to accept that visual experience is a common religious phenomenon, we need some kind of methodology or some kind of typology which allows these phenomena, these visual phenomena, to be seen as related to each other without dismissing key differences between them. Now, I've already mentioned I want to talk about agency, and I thought I initially came up with three pairs of binary opposites of whether the experience is voluntary or involuntary, whether it's prescribed or unprescribed, and whether it's controlled or uncontrolled. But I am very aware that there could be all sorts of alternative binaries that could populate that list. So whether images are anthropomorphic or consist of animals or objects, whether I don't know if expected or unexpected is simply a duplication of what I already have, whether they're desired or undesired, whether it's public or private, And a threefold, it's not a binary, I can't think of what the three-part equivalent would be, but whether the experience is while one's waking, while one's dreaming, or while one's meditating. Yeah, but leaving those aside, I just want to pursue the intentional, the agency angle on this. And where you have three binaries, you can arrange them in terms of three axes, and you can propagate those axes as a three-dimensional solid, as a cube, and you can then populate the cube, the faces of the cube, with your binaries. And so you can have prescribed and unprescribed on the opposite faces in one axis, and controlled and uncontrolled on the faces in another axis, and voluntary and involuntary on another axis on opposite faces. And obviously, if you look at each corner of that cube, you can see each possible combination of those three binaries. Yeah, and in fact, there are all told 8 possible combinations. And then applying that to the instances that I've just been through, the visionary experiences, or the visual experiences, or the visualizations, which I've already discussed, we can see that the enunciation in the New Testament is involuntary. Mary doesn't, she has no choice. It's uncontrolled and it's unprescribed. It's a one-off event. Yeah. The burning bush seen by Moses is involuntary, uncontrolled, and unprescribed. Muhammad's visit from Jibril is the same, involuntary, uncontrolled, unprescribed. And Krishna's mouth, the vision of the universe, the cosmos inside Krishna's mouth, is involuntary, uncontrolled, unprescribed. If we compare that with the Manjushri sadhana, we find that these are all opposites. The Manjushri sadhana is voluntary because people choose to take up a sadhana. Yeah, it's controlled because you, the practitioner, go through the process. You control the process, and it's prescribed because there is a sadhana. There is a text describing what should happen and what will happen. Yeah. If we look at Maya's dream, we can see that in her case, it's involuntary and uncontrolled, but it is prescribed because this is what happens with the birth of Buddhas. Yeah. In the Lotus Sutra, the action for the people who experience the visionary experience of the stupa emerging from the earth containing the 2 Buddhas, it's involuntary and it's uncontrolled. But this action is prescribed because we're told this always happens when the Lotus Sutra is recited. In Borāṅ Kamatan, the visual experiences are voluntary because it's the practitioner is engaging in a practice voluntarily. The experiences in some versions of Borāṅ Kamatan are controlled, and in others uncontrolled. If you look particularly at the tradition of Borāṅ Kamatan from Wat Ratchasitaram in Thonburi, you get the impression that the appearance of the nimitta is a controlled experience, but in other contexts, the nimitta are treated as independent entities with their own agency, which may or may not attend you as the meditator. And in some respects, they are prescribed, and in other respects, unprescribed. So again, there's a strong tendency in some Borāṅ Kamatan traditions to define what nimitta look like down to various combinations of colors. And in other respects, there's this tradition which I think Kate alluded to, and I was trying to gesture towards with that image of the limes, where a kind of narrative event is to be interpreted as an appearance of nimitta. And finally, we have the Mahāgovinda story, which I tried to summarize for you, where the experience is voluntary. Mahāgovinda sets out to see Brahmā, but the experience is uncontrolled, and he's rather alarmed by it when it finally happens. And it's prescribed because he knows that people who practice the Brahma Viharas will get to see, or can get to see, Brahmā. So looking at that table, that analysis, I mean, if that analysis is valid, then clearly theophany, the appearance of God, presumes a kind of lack of agency on the part of the person who has that visionary experience. And that's why we talk in terms of visionary experience, which sounds rather passive. Yeah. And that's because the person who experiences doesn't have the agency. It's God, who after all is the creator, has the agency. Buddhist approaches, some have elements of a lack of agency, but tend towards agency on the part of the practitioner, of the person who experiences the visionary, or experiences the vision, or does the visualization. Yeah. So much for that. That's a little excursion into my typological or method byway. What happens in the Mahāgovinda Sutta? Well, the Brahmā offers Mahāgovinda a teaching. He says, what do you want to know? You can ask me a question. And Mahāgovinda comes up with a question. He says, how should a mortal be, and how might he train in order to attain the immortal realm of Brahmā? Yeah. Now this amatang, the immortal realm of Brahmā, is an important term here, because the Brahmaloka, everything is transient and impermanent in the Buddhist analysis. So even the Brahmalokas are impermanent. So there's something particular going on here, that he refers to the immortal realm of Brahma. And the Brahma's response is, he, the practitioner, must give up possessiveness, have a one-pointed mind, eko dibutto. He must be compassionate, karunadimutto, and be free from putrefaction, which is a peculiar term, and should be celibate. And just for those who want to know what niramaganda, to be free from putrefaction, means, it's defined in the sutta itself. They should be free from anger, lies, fraud, deceit, and so on, the rest of that list there. So what happens after this? The vision for Mahāgovinda, in the sutta, the vision for Mahāgovinda finishes, and he emerges from his retreat. This is all takes place at the end of a period of solitary, self-imposed solitary confinement that lasts 3 or 4 months. He goes back into his ordinary world and he says, I'm going to go forth. I'm going to pabudge. I'm going to take up the pabudja. And I am going to cultivate the metta bhavana, Maitri bhavana, as a method for reaching Brahmaloka. And that's exactly what he does. And he both does it himself and teaches it to others. So what we need to understand here, and here I'm coming back to the issue of the term amata, the amata Brahmaloka. What we do know is that the Brahmalokas are not immortal, but are finite. And I think it's fairly well discussed, fairly well known in the secondary literature on these early texts, that the very earliest Buddhist community employed the language of Brahma to designate its highest goal, Nibbana. Yeah. So the understanding is that prior to the Buddhist community actually developing its own distinctive language to describe its goals and processes, it adopted the language of the community around it. And the community of the language around it was the language of Brahmanical, what we might call Brahmanical Hinduism. And so they used the term Brahma or Brahmā to designate the highest goal of Nibbana. And so immortal in texts, these very early texts, is really a synonym for Nibbana. Yeah. Religious and visionary experience has to be framed one way or another. And for the very early Buddhists, it had to be framed, and the frame they had to hand was a Brahmanical one. So this is just one model, perhaps, for visionary experience, if anything that I've said is valid. The interesting thing is that at the end of the Dīgha Nikāya text and the Dīrgha Agama text, in other words, the Theravada and Dharmakuptika versions of this story, they have a kind of coda or a colophon, which is not present in the Mahavastu version or in T8, the Taisho number 8 translation. And this colophon or coda sets out to contrast Brahmā with Buddha. It's a kind of quasi-historical critique. And really what they're doing is they're showing us two frames. We have the frame which is embedded in the material of the sutta itself, which is a Brahmanical one, using Brahmanical language for designating the goal of Nibbana. And then this coda, which comes along and says, and I quote key passages on the right-hand side of the screen, the Buddha is made to say that spiritual path of mine doesn't lead to disillusionment, dispassion, cessation, peace, insight, awakening, and extinguishment. It only leads as far as rebirth in the Brahma realm. In other words, two versions of this text attach a little footnote which say, hang on, this this doesn't lead to the real Buddhist goal, and go on to say that the only way to get to the real Buddhist goal is to follow the Eightfold Path and become a member of the Arya Sangha. So we see here a literary attempt to reclaim this text in the light of later language development. So that's the end of my presentation. I just wanted to finish with this lovely image by Mike Moyers of the Annunciation, which I think captures very well the sense of the emergence of Brahma Sanankumara for Mahāgovinda. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Andrew. And so we begin the discussion. Yes. Go ahead.
Oh, thank you, Andrew. I'm just looking up for you up there. Right hand side. Right hand. Oh, there you are. Yes. Thank you very much for a very enjoyable talk and for those pictures. I was very interested you looked at the Mahāgovinda because there are actually 6 suttas in the Dīgha Nikāya actively associated with constructing a mandala in some way. There's the Atanatiya, the Mahāsamaya, the Mahāsudassana, and the Skilton, as well as the Mahāgovinda. And I was wondering whether you felt that we should be developing a vocabulary of discussing these things across traditions, which I think you are saying that, and what you considered, say, about the Mahāsudassana Sutta, which has the Buddha remembering a past life, another sort of lost Jataka, because there is a counterpart but nothing like it, in which a universal monarch, and the verb used is marpeti. He sort of causes to create a palace, which is in fact a mandala, the lotus ponds coming from the 4 directions to the middle, and then he practices the Brahma Viharas as jhanas, and then at the end he has to dissolve it because he is about to pass away. And so I wondered if you had thought of looking at other suttas within the Dīgha Nikāya to see how much your sort of emergent typology could be applied to them, because I think it'd be really interesting if you did.
Yes, sorry, was that Sarah?
Yes.
Hello, Sarah. I can't see you from the screen.
No, we can see you very well. Thanks. Yeah.
Yeah, I think that's a really interesting question, because you've pointed our attention to this group of suttas in the Dīgha, and my attention has turned to those, and I have thought this about those, and I have discussed this with people. I mean, I first wrote on this in mid-1980s. And since then, a couple of people have published on material related to this, Rupert Gethin and Richard Gombrich in particular. Yes, I agree. I think these are worth examining. I think that in doing that, one needs to do some very interesting diachronic analysis, examining the textual history of these texts. I feel confident to kind of claim earliness for the material in the Mahāgovinda because of the language it uses. And it specifically uses Pali terminology, which one tends to associate with very early Pali materials. You know the kind of thing I mean, yeah. I haven't yet done that with the other texts in that group that you mentioned, but I do think there's tremendous potential there for applying that. And of course, the typology that I propose is very provisional, and it's, you know, kind of made up, isn't it? So actually what it needs is people to test it and to see what is the most productive application of a typology of that type. Whether the particular terms I've used are preserved or not is another matter, but yeah, I think that group of suttas could be a very productive focus of this kind of attention. I think we should be applying it, although, you know, we do need to look at their comparators in other traditions of the early schools of Buddhism, how they're preserved in other languages and so on.
Okay, and we have an online question from Peter Harvey. Peter, go ahead.
Okay. Hi. An interesting case. An interesting case, of course, is Brahmā Sahampati appearing unsought to the Buddha, and moreover, in one Samyutta passage, he is seen as a non-returner.
Yeah.
So he's a Brahma, but he's almost enlightened. And kind of related to that, perhaps, is the Brahma Viharas are amongst the states which are doors to the deathless, if you enter them and then see them as conditioned. So there's a few connections there, I think.
Yes. Yes, I think there's a lot of material to be unpacked in this connection. Although, I mean, I seem to remember that the Brahma Viharas for example, in the Visuddhimagga are kind of demoted to a not very functional level in terms of what kind of meditational stages they can lead to. They're given a very lowly role in that taxonomy of kammatthana propounded by Buddhaghosa.
Yeah. But certainly now the Anguttara, the four Brahma Viharas, the four jhanas, and the first three formless, doors to the deathless, if you reflect on them as conditioned and impermanent. Yeah.
Brilliant. Really good.
Yes. Oh, okay. Maybe you go ahead.
Yes. Hi, Andrew. This is P here. I've got a question in a way, and also some comments before that. My comments relate to how these kind of experience and vision and images like Brahma appearing, as well as in terms of light, and also kind of the Maya, Mahamaya having the dream, and then the elephants coming down. These imagery and images, they kind of appear in the modern Burmese teachers and their hagiographies that goes with that. And yes, so for example, I was thinking, I think Lady Seattle has these kind of background story in terms of how, you know, at the conception, the mother has various dreams, and then Solomon Seattle as well. So I'm just wondering, because you walk across, you know, early Buddhism as well as contemporary Theravada Buddhist societies, especially in Thailand. So I wonder whether you have come across, you know, biographies and hagiographies of meditation teachers in modern period, any kind of those kind of imageries and usage. My thinking is that that kind of narrative is very kind of, at least Theravada orientated hagiography, and it's giving a framework within which various groups of practitioners can make sense of the teachings of these meditators and meditation teachers, and giving authority to an extent.
The short answer to the very concrete question you formulated 2 sentences back is no. I can't think of specific biographies of meditation teachers in which we can find these kinds of motifs and tropes. But you know, without question, these motifs and tropes, or some motifs and tropes, are very powerful within tradition, and it's hardly surprising that key aspects of the Buddha story, shall we say, are recycled or emerge in later centuries in relation to important figures of authority. Because, you know, how do you imbue any figure with quality of authority? It's no good just saying they are the boss. You have to somehow communicate the inherent status of their bossness. Yeah, and one of the ways to do that is to incorporate powerful tropes from tradition into their story, and so to completely move to a completely different sphere. I'm staggered by how often the tropes of being abandoned in the forest emerge in Buddhist stories, in key Buddhist stories. And of course, we know them from the Mahabharata and crucially from the Ramayana, but they occur in this motif occurs in so many Buddhist stories in really unexpected places. And these are powerful narrative tropes which really move people and persuade people. And so the tropes relating to birth and so on are obviously going to function in the same way. I think that's a rather generalized answer to what you're saying, but I specifically, I'm not aware of biographies of other meditation teachers that contain these narrative tropes. I'd be interested to know if I mean, you mentioned, was it Lady Sierra?
Yes, Lady Sierra and Sono as well. As far as I know, of course, I think there are others. Because Gustav Hoffman, again, he mentions that and differentiate between biographies and hagiographies within Burmese context. Yes.
Yeah. That's great.
Yeah. Okay, maybe Kate first and then Gwen, and then we finish and begin the discussion.
Hi, Andrew. Kate here.
Okay.
Can I go back to the Jataka nature of the text? So I'm just wondering whether the fact that it might be a Jataka, and in at least that it's talking about a previous lifetime, is relevant to what the highest goal is, because in lifetimes before the Buddha, the highest ethics is taking the precept, so there wouldn't have been a possibility to, you know, get nirvana, and whether those comments then, the additions are perhaps losing sight of the Jataka nature of the story, the additions in is it in T8? No, yeah, T8 and I've forgotten which ones were added. And also, what happens to Mahāgovinda? I mean, if it's a Jataka, what does he become in the future?
Oh, at the end of the story, at the end of the sutta, Panchasika the Gandharva, who is telling all of this to the Buddha. Do you remember the initial frame, the biggest frame of this story? Panchasika says, hey, do you remember that then? Because he's just related a story talking about what he has seen in the heaven of the 33, including this. He's described Brahmā arriving there, and then he's described Brahmā telling a story. And the story that Brahmā tells is a story about a previous lifetime of the Buddha. And so all the frames are then unpacked right at the end. And Panchasika says to the Buddha, hey, do you remember that then? And the Buddha says, yeah, I remember that, all right. And I was Mahāgovinda. And so there's a samadhana at the end. The samadhana is a kind of classic component of the Jataka, at least in the Pali presentation of these texts, in which at the end of the story of a past life of the Bodhisattva, the Buddha identifies who was who in this early story, and so the Buddha is shown identifying himself as Mahāgovinda or vice versa. Yeah, so that's what happens. Is that?
Thank you. And so that probably does make the going to the Brahma loka as the highest outcome make sense in terms of being a Jataka, and that there couldn't have been an option for Nibbana because he was still the Bodhisattva.
I agree with you, and because it's you, I'll put it this way. I think that is a very literalistic reading of this material. And I know you'll take this in the right spirit, but I think indeed that is exactly the view taken by the editors of the text who added this section, which is not present in other versions of the text, of the Mahāgovinda story. Yeah. So this colophon, which says, hang on, this isn't about Nibbana, is an addition that's made to two versions, which are quite closely related historically, the Theravada and the Dharmaguptaka versions. They're both Stavira traditions. Yeah. And I think part of the rationale for making that addition is saying, oh, hang on, this is before the Buddha appeared, and therefore you can't have nibbana, you can't have awakening. The past doesn't exist in its the past all the way to Buddha doesn't explicitly exist yet, because the Buddha hasn't emerged in our era, in our aeon, to teach it. And that's logically true, but I think that is a strategy for trying to deal with this very early language from the very early tradition, in which the language of the Brahmanical tradition was used, probably temporarily, for the designation of Buddhist goals.
So for you, that description is an early description of the ultimate goal.
Yes, I think that's a reasonable interpretation, yes.
Okay, last question, a brief one, maybe. When?
Not a question. Hello, Andrew. My name's Gwendolyn Morrison. I really liked the pictures that you put up and the variation of pictures that you put up. As a sacred artist, I've done the practices of the application of gold in Thangka. And also I have a very lovely friend who passed away, unfortunately, during the COVID period, whose name was Icon John, known internationally as Icon John, but it's John Coleman was his name, who practiced Christian icons. He was an icon writer. And he taught me the application of gold from a Silk Road tradition of Christian monks that he learned about in Egypt. And the application of gold is very slightly different in the two traditions, but actually the practices are very, very similar. And when you were talking with your bridge about the kind of, what did you use, the kind of passive perspective, and the differentiating that from the more active, I think you used, what was the word, agency, the active. And I was just putting it forward really that maybe, since you were looking at developing this methodology, maybe some kind of question around this differentiation between the active and passive. So when you're applying gold to a statue, you kind of float it on with water, and the water gradually dries out and it adheres the gold to the statue. So you don't touch it, and you don't have to do anything, no intervention, you know. It just is a function of the gradual, the water evaporating, and then the gold adheres. So I don't know if that's any helpful, but just that reflection on the methodology, I wondered if maybe I could just offer that.
Thank you very much. I think that's a really delightful comment. And I think highly relevant, because material culture feeds into ideas and religious practice. And I would love to explore the methodology of the application of gold, both in European Middle Eastern tradition, but also in South Asian. And indeed, we might find very interesting information arising from that. But I think the interaction of material culture and material practice with conceptualization of various things, in this case religious goals and so on, is very, very relevant. So I'm thank you very much.
All right, thank you very much. Just a tiny comment also I wanted to insert here. You mentioned the enunciation many times, and you categorize it as a non-prescriptive thing, but I thought that, you know, an angel appeared to Joseph and predicted the birth of the baby. And in fact, he said this will be to fulfill a prophecy.
Oh,
Behold, a virgin shall be with child, right? So I think it's not non-prescriptive, it's really prescriptive.
thank you very, very, very much. I mean, that's my ignorance here of the Christian tradition. Thank you.
Yeah, I was thinking a similar thing, that whether you see it as prescriptive or not depends on whether you just know this one moment or whether you look at the whole sort of concepts of prophecy within the Abrahamic traditions.
Yes.
Well, I took a longer perspective for Maya's dream and others, so Imre's comment is completely relevant from that point of view. So thank you very much, Imre.
All right, thank you. And I see Dorothy has a very quick comment, maybe?
Yeah, very quick. All the medieval depictions of the Annunciation have Mary with a book. So there is more agency in the image than the traditional and modernist retrospective reading of these things. They tend to overlook the book. So Mary was actually an agent when Jibril or the angel Gabriel arrived. He is not a real, he is a mental image.
Julian Norwich and the other Christian mystics.
But it's in some traditions. I mean, there are different Christian traditions, of course. Anyway, let's conclude here, and then we're going to begin our discussion. I guess we can continue the same discussion, and I'm not sure who's leading this discussion. Chris disappeared just now. So maybe I begin, and yeah, we're open for discussion. Yes, Kate.
I'd like to make a comment on the discussion that was happening just now about material culture, and just I've mentioned in my talk the book by Daniel M. Steward on the Siddharma Smrityuktana Sutra, and in it the influence of painting is explicit. So the influence of painting on meditative experience is it's an explicit model. So just to add that in.
Very, thank you. And Chris, did you want to kind of lead the discussion, the general discussion, or is there any theme?
I don't mind. Well, not so much a theme, other than, well, as I said earlier, we did stop a couple of times to make sure that we did have time for coffee, tea, whatever else. So if anyone has any questions they remember from earlier, or comments from earlier papers, this is one opportunity. So if something has stuck with you from an earlier paper, I suppose we can foreground that.
Yeah, actually, we had a number of questions. Like, you had a question to, who was it to? Dylan, yes. So maybe this is the time to ask. And Henrik had a question for Dylan as well.
Right. So my question is, you were talking about referential image, and we go back to that topic because it's so interesting. My question is, you were talking about alangana, that phrase, and I'm wondering whether in the sources that you looked at, are there any kind of different levels we did talk about, as in just one way of looking at the referential image and so on? So
thank you. That's a very interesting question. And I would say that at times it's used simply in a descriptive sense. I just say, you know, the text will be prescribing referentially image such and such. But more often than not, it's actually being criticized. So the whole notion of this activity is then criticized. So more generally, the term Sādhana, which I would translate as visualize, is then used in a more neutral setting. So the overarching term, Ananda, Mikvah, is used to, I mean, there are instances where it's powerful, because we had the example of the rope of referential imaging being tied with smriti and with the goad of acumen. There it's a positive sense, but more generally, it tends to be considered a lower form of practice when compared to non-imaging.
The reason I asked this question is in the Dengru tradition. Again, we use that kind of alamana or aramana in Pali. That term quite a fair bit, and there are similarities. So the mind, whether it goes to these kind of referential images, or it's just sit there without, I think you use the word non-imaging.
Yeah.
So just observing and then kind of allowing, even the images kind of disappears, or so that kind of thing. So, but these very subtle and refined mental activities, it's very difficult to catch. I mean, in practice, yeah.
I think that's a very interesting parallel with Kate Robin's presentation on nimitta and animita. It's a kind of similar movement from one state with signs or images to a state without signs, without images.
All right, thank you. Yes, Sarah.
I was actually still very interested in the point Dorothea made about the active and the Christian arrangement, because I think this goes to the heart of the evocation and the invoked form. Are you actually creating something? Is it marketing? Are you actually making something, or is something happening? And I found it very interesting when you sort of made the visions come after the visualization and stopped in about the 14th century, and in the Dzogchen tradition they started to introduce visions. And I find this a very interesting axis about invocation and evocation, if you like. And I think Dorothy, in a way, was alluding to that, because if you look at the early Christian mystics, it is interesting, they are not passive. They are not involuntary. Julian of Norwich, Teresa, they undertake very serious exercises as a practitioner would in a Tibetan tradition, and then the visions happen. And even their bodies are upright. If you look at Julian of Norwich, when she's ill, she sits upright too, and then the vision comes. So I just thought that was interesting throughout today, actually, that there's been this.
But it's only in the canonical, say, gospel something. This doesn't happen, right? This is in a Christian tradition. This is a mystical tradition.
Well, yes, I don't know. And I wouldn't like to judge. I'd say grace is something which is very important in the Christian tradition.
Yes.
And in a way, when you talk about grace, you're talking about something at that intersection.
Yes.
I would have thought.
Full of grace. Yeah.
Yes, yeah.
Yes.
If I could just add something to that, I mean, I think there's also something to be said about the potentially revelatory nature of such visions. So it's like a practitioner will do certain exercises effectively in order to put themselves in a state or in a condition where something can happen, which is then beyond their agency. And then these visions might take on a kind of life of their own by revealing sutras, by revealing tantras, and of course, what is revealed in these cases, Buddhist tradition, is also repackaging textual segments, but perhaps inspired by such visions. So this question of agency and non-agency is, I think, very relevant both to Buddhist and other.
So what's the sentence? Did you say something about I can't remember, someone mentioned childlike drawings in the sand.
Oh, yes.
Yeah, and this is really nice because, I mean, even in the Christian tradition, we get children who are visionaries. They don't do any practices, just as children, their visions come. And drawing in the sand is the name of the very origin of sacred art is just drawing in the sand. So I appreciate children very much. Thank you.
Thank you. Yes.
Yeah, please excuse me if I'm missing the point, but to me, it sounds that in the case of early Christian mystics, that very well may very well be a visionary experience. But in the case of Annunciation, I feel that may well be just a narrative invention to glorify the birth of Jesus Christ. And I feel something similar with Maya's dream. So I'm not sure if we can treat these stories as examples of visionary experiences.
Okay. Maybe this comment is most relevant to Peter. No, I don't know. Or any other comments here? Responses to this?
I think you get into a very difficult area then, because I've just been translating the Jataka Nidana, and each Buddha has a visionary. I mean, it happens all the time. So I don't know, you get into a very difficult area of truth and reality that is difficult.
Yes, Kathy. You don't have to raise your hand, just this is open discussion.
Okay, well, actually, I just wanted to hear Henrik's comment.
Maybe he's tuned
Is he
out.
around? Have we lost him? He seems to be there, but okay.
Sorry, what you wanted to hear what, Kathy?
Henrik's comment.
Oh, Henrik.
Henrik wanted to make a comment earlier to Dylan's paper. Okay, so in that case, we can stop here actually, and maybe continue this discussion. Yes, final question, the comment.
Thank you very much. So I'm going back to Andrews. So my point is that I think, to my way of thinking, there is a real dichotomy between language and reality, especially in Theravada Buddhism. I would say something like that. Because, for example, the concept of Nibbana and Dhamma, when I say Dhamma or Nibbana in Theravada Buddhism, the sutta, Sinsapa Sutta in Sanyutta Nikāya, Dhammanti Bhavita Satchikata Nibbana Maganda, Dhamma or Nibbana is a whole ramification of human purity and clarity of human mind. But how to express it fully using lexicographies and phonetics and other terms of language. So it is not a linguistic expression entirely. So I would say we have to transcend the linguistic meaning for the Nibbana and Dhamma for some kind of universal concept. So shedding light on that, I would say there is a real struggle between the conventional truth and the absolute truth. So I would suggest some concepts like the truth, reality, and Dhamma do not relate either very comparative and relative terms coming from language and linguistic and the evolutionary other disciplinaries in modern times. So yes, this is kind of my suggestion, the dichotomy between the conventional applications in many disciplinaries and the absolute truth in Dhamma in many branches of Buddhism.
All right, thank you. And with that comment, then we close here and we can continue talking over dinner and the break. Thank you very much for this long day, actually, but very exciting day. So thank you for participating.
Thank you.
Okay, great. Thank you as well, everyone at home.